Okay, so I am talking today with William Wall. He is a Irish poet and short story writer, as well as a novelist. William, just to get started, can you tell us what your childhood was like? What was like growing up?
Well, I grew up in a small village in Ireland on the coast of Cork Harbour, and my father was a farmer, a very small farm, 10 acres, and my mother kept a small shop. And from the very beginning, I grew up with the idea that, women worked and that was it. There was no question about it. They were both very, very hardworking, and uh, I had I think I could safely say, a really happy childhood, which is a bit of a handicap for an Irish writer, because you're sort of expected to have had a miserable childhood. But I escaped it. Um, I had a sister. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago, and I have an older brother. And I grew up, working on the farm, um, in summertime, swimming in the sea. My father also was a fisherman, so I did a lot of fishing with him. And I suppose the sea kind of entered my consciousness in a particular way. It features in all my books one way or the other. It's kind of critics have remarked that it's almost a personality and almost a character in its own right in a lot of my work. And yeah, a very happy childhood. I went to the local national school, which was when I went there, a very small school. There were 8 people in my class, and went on to secondary school and university then after that. I was the second in my family to go to university. My brother went before me. My sister didn't want to go. And my parents had both left school at primary school, and but they were self-educated, very, very
Mm.
well read, and very interested in books and reading.
Do you have a childhood memory that is very fond that like sticks out to you?
Uh, I can remember so many things. One of the things when you talk about fondness, one of the things that often comes back to me is being ill in bed and feeling my mother's cool hand on my forehead. It always kind of, especially if I have a fever myself, that's a memory that always comes back to me. Um, my father telling stories, he was a great one for telling stories or singing. Um, he was a sort of a self-taught musician. In fact, he was too poor in his childhood to buy a violin, and so he built his own violin. And he also played the what we call the box, which is the button accordion, kind of a typical traditional Irish musical instrument. And hearing him sing particularly is a very fond memory.
Did he keep the violin until you were older? Like he actually played from the same one or
No, no, it was long gone by the time I was born. I think he probably had it in his 20s. The the My mother uh, fell in love with him, I think, because she saw him playing in the band, one of these 1930s dance bands, And uh, the interesting thing about it, I suppose, is that my father's father died when he was 12 years of age, when my father was 20 years of age, that is. And my father took over the family farm, which was quite a good-sized farm. And when and his mother intended him to marry the daughter of the farm next door. She was an only child, and that would have united the two farms. This is the way farmers think, are used to anyway. Probably still do. And instead of that, he fell in love with my mother, who was a seamstress, a dressmaker. And my grandmother never accepted my mother. And she told my father that my mother, who was very beautiful in her youth, would never be anything but an ornament for the window. And she told him that if he married her, she would throw him out. And so she did. When they went ahead and got married, my father was thrown out of the family farm. He was the oldest. He should have inherited it, and she threw him out. And they were so badly off that he went back working as a labourer on the farm, and she wouldn't pay him the full labourer's wage, which was £2. And instead of that, she gave him £1 10 shillings, which is £1.50 at the time a week, because he was family. So kind of an ironic twist to the whole thing. They eventually made their way. My father did various things, and my mother did a lot of dressmaking, and eventually they got set up themselves. But it was tough, and grandmother Wall was never a favorite in our family. She died when I was quite young, but my mother never referred to her in any nice way.
Um, did your father ever reconcile with her? Not really.
My father didn't hold grudges, and I wouldn't say, I'm not sure reconciled is the right word, but he didn't hold it against. For example, his younger brother inherited the farm, and my father never held it against him, and would turn up at harvest time to help with the harvest and
Hmm.
so on like that. So I don't think really. I mean, my father was happy with his bargain, if you like. He was madly in love with my mother, and I don't think the being thrown off the family farm uh, was in any way balanced out what he felt he gained, you know.
Hmm. Was there something your mom or dad said to you that really impressed itself on your memory? Something that you really remember
Um,
them
I
to?
think I suppose when I think of them, I think of my father was a mischievous sort of man in a strange way, and he had a mischievous sense of humor, you know. And I remember the very first holiday they took. At the time, we didn't own a car. What we had instead was a small truck, you know, a farmer's truck. And so they saved up for several years for this holiday, and they toured Ireland in this farmer's truck. And they would arrive into hotels, and my father would step out of the truck and hand the keys to the man to park the truck. You know, he'd say, "Would you park that for me, please?" And he often described the shock on the faces of the guys in the hotel who had to do the parking. You know, uh, and but they used to say, there's no difference between people; we're all the same, and that really impressed itself on me. You take people as they come. They were as happy talking to uh, the local doctor who was kind of like royalty in that area, as they were talking to other farmers or waiters in restaurants or whatever. They made no distinction whatever between people. There was no snobbery or and then when they became a bit more successful, there was still no feeling of snobbery or no feeling of being in any way inferior to anybody else.
How has that affected you?
I suppose I tend to treat people the same way as far as I possibly can. Um, I, 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 I don't. I mean, you're kind of asking me a question that I don't think about very much. I just take people as I find them, and if people are nice to me, I'm nice to them. If they're not, it's as simple as that. Um, I don't like networking, for example. I don't do networking. Um, and I've often been told by my agent uh, that I'd be far better off if I did a bit more, but it always seems fake to me.
Hmm. What I know we touched on this a little bit as we were emailing back and forth, but um, what do you love about life? Like, what makes it beautiful to you, worth living, I guess.
Um, I suppose first and foremost, love. Um, I don't think I could live without Liz, my wife. Um, and then family, my two sons, my daughters-in-law, my grandsons, and then friends. Um, you know, I'd hate to live without writing.
Mm.
I think I'd find it very, very hard. Uh, that makes life worthwhile as well. But I could live without writing more easily than I can live without family or friends. Um, so that's the beauty of life. And then, you know, I love other things. I love swimming, for example. I love the sea. I love good food and good wine. And I like good company.
What what makes it hard? Like, especially like in this current season, what do you find the hardest thing?
Um, well, here in Italy, we're suffering the effects of climate change at the moment. This is, what is it, the 12th of October, and the temperature is still over 20. It should be well under 20 at this stage. It's far too warm. We're still swimming. The Italians are swimming, which is whatever but an Irish person swimming. It's accepted that Irish people are crazy. But Italians don't swim outside of August usually, but they're still swimming. The sea is very warm, too warm.
Mm.
So it's an easy season to live here at the moment. At home in Ireland, it's wet and colder and getting darker too. So um, that's harder to do. In terms of what makes life hard for me, I suppose my illness. Um, I contracted a disease called Still's disease at 12 years of age.
Mm.
It's a form of rheumatoid arthritis,
Mm.
and you know, nowadays they can stop it uh, in most cases anyway. But when I got it at 12, that was about 1967. There was really no effective treatment for it, and so I still have it. And that's the thing. You know, it makes walking difficult. Distances. I mean, I have no difficulty walking, but I can't walk very far. And it makes things like that. I can get bad periods when I find writing difficult and other things as well. You know, so that makes life difficult. I can do without that. Quite happily do without that.
So, that is the symptoms mostly pain or is it weakness or
It's mostly it's two things. It's joint pain, and it
okay.
moves around from joint to joint. So um, for a while, it affected my hands very badly, and I thought I wouldn't be able to continue writing. And then it moved on to, you know, my legs or my feet or my knees or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, so it fits around from joint to joint. It's a systemic disease. It's an autoimmune disease. And I suppose one of the positive things about it is that because it's an autoimmune disease, it's essentially created by your immune system. So as you get older, your immune system gets older as well. So the disease gets older with you, and therefore not as vigorous or effective or whatever. So I feel healthier now than I did when I was 25 in actual fact.
Wow.
Um, but then the second big factor is tiredness. When it's active, I can feel kind of tired all the time, a
Hmm.
lot of the time, but not all the time. It's not always active.
How did you know you had it when you were 12? Did the symptoms just come on or
Yeah, I was at boarding school at the time, and my I found I could hardly get out of bed. Um, I struggled to get down to the breakfast room or the classes or whatever, and eventually I got to the stage where I couldn't get out of bed, and my parents came and took me home, and my GP called, and or doctor. I don't know if you call him a GP or physician, family physician. And he said he didn't know what it was. And he sent me to hospital. And I spent 6 months in hospital. And after about 3 months, I had been treated by a pediatrician who clearly didn't know what I had. It was not it's a pretty rare, a pretty rare disease really in children. Um, Even though there are a couple of thousand children every year in Ireland get it,
Mm.
it's still pretty rare. And the eventually he called in a rheumatologist, and he was the first rheumatologist in our city, and he diagnosed it immediately. And I can remember waking up because I was feverish and sort of out of my head a lot of the time. I can remember waking up to hear two people shouting at each other in this hospital ward. And standing at the end of the bed was a very tall man, who was the pediatrician whom I knew, and this very short, bald man whom I'd never met before. And I woke in time to hear the short man tell the tall man, "You are killing this boy." And I looked around me, and the ward was empty of all the staff. And I could see a door slightly open into a corridor, and I could see three heads of nurses peering around the door in shock at the thought of two consultant doctors shouting at each other in front of patients, you know. But anyway, the pediatrician left, and the rheumatologist took over, and I started to get back on my feet after that. And that's how that happened.
You must have been super glad that the rheumatoid doctor.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, in hospital you become kind of dependent on things very quickly, and I had become dependent on the pediatrician. So initially, even though he wasn't doing me any good, I still kind of placed all my trust in him, you know.
Hmm.
And so initially, when the rheumatologist took over, I resented it, but I very quickly came to admire him and be really grateful for him. And he was my rheumatologist then for, I suppose, 20 years probably
Wow.
after that. So yeah, he was a good man.
So when you were talking about the fever earlier, was that because did you have frequent fevers and that's why that memory stuck?
Yeah, yeah. A feature a feature of Still's disease is what they call diurnal fevers, which is fever morning and fever evening, like clockwork. About 6 o'clock in the morning, my temperature would start to rise, and by eight, I'd be running a temperature of 103 or 104,
Oh
and
wow.
then uh, it would start to go down again, and then by evening, uh, it would start to go up again. Usually about 5 o'clock in the evening, it would start to rise again, and then sometimes the clock sort of went out, so you ended up getting it in the middle of the night instead. You know, it's kind of strange, but it's a regular pattern of two fevers a day, whatever time it would start. You know,
So your mom would she just sit up with you all the time or?
a lot of the time. And then you know, I'd wake up with the sheets soaked with sweat and you know, very unpleasant, and for part of the time out of my head and so on like that. Uh, it's it's a funny thing. I was asked recently. Well, I've been asked several times to write something about it, and the strange thing is that uh, I am really unable to remember. I can remember, uh, if you like, technical details or historical details about it, if you want to call it that. I can remember when I got it, and
Hmm.
I can remember various treatments that were tried and various things like that. But I have no real memory that I could use as a way of describing something of the actual pain and the temperature and so on like that. And I often think, they say about women in childbirth that after a while, uh, a woman loses the ability to remember the pain. She can remember she had pain during childbirth, and she can remember how bad it was and so on like that. But there's no actual grasp of the pain, no
Hmm.
kind of real clear memory of it. And that it's a sort of protective mechanism. And I think that applies to all pain, actually. Once you get over it, I think you can't get back there, and it's just as well.
Hmm. As a 12-year-old boy though, how were you grappling with it? I mean, that's really hard being an invalid when you're 12, so you have probably lots of friends and other people you know who are living relatively normally. Um,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
how did you wrestle with that when you were little?
Well, the first thing to be said about it is that at 12 years of age, you're quite adaptable. And I know people who got the disease later in life. I know a woman who got it post-menopause, for example. And I think it's a lot harder to adapt when you're older. A young person, I settled into the fact that this was me and that was it.
Hmm.
That's not to say that it was easy. Obviously, aside from the pain, the fever, and all that kind of stuff, I had been sort of athletic, not a particularly good sportsman, but I loved long distance running, for example, and I played some of our Gaelic games in Ireland very badly. I always said I was in the F team, but um, I still enjoyed physical activity, and that really stopped. I never really ran again afterwards. And so I definitely missed that. And I sometimes think that missing that was part of the reason that I became a writer, because I was at home for a year, only had to go to school after I came out of hospital. And my parents just fed me books, and I began writing as a result. I think I began writing partly inspired by the books and partly in the hope of sort of creating my own uh, adventures in my head. And I think writing is a kind of compensation. But I began writing in that year when I was at home, and I think it's a kind of compensation for what happened to me. I recently was asked to write something about my early writings, and as it happened, my mother collected everything that I wrote, kept it all, and I went back and got it, and I still have it somewhere in the attic. And I had written in the space of 2.5 or 3 years, I had written about 280 poems
Oh, wow.
and 20 stories. And one of the stories was actually quite good. And juvenile writings, you're generally embarrassed by them afterwards. And one or two of the poems were quite good. In fact, I could see the root of how I write poetry now in some of those poems. So at 12 years of age, 13, 14 years of age, I was actually quite serious about being a writer.
Hmm. What were your poems mainly about?
Oh, they were mostly about love, which of course I'm talking about romantic love, which I hadn't experienced. But that never stops me writing. Love and the beauty of nature and all those kind of things that inspire young people. There were lots and lots of poems to some imaginary girlfriend and things like that.
Did you save them for your wife later to show her?
Yeah, she's had a look at them as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What if you wrote about your life, like a book, um, what do you think you'd call it?
Um, I did write. I did write something looking back at more or less what I've just described to you now, and I called it "Stealing from Winter." And it's a good title because it begins with the line that Still's disease is a winter of the bones, and then I move on from that then to talk about how there are moments of beauty and of love and of joy that I regard as stolen from that winter of the bones. Um, you
Hmm.
know, sort of tricking the disease and circumventing it. So stealing from winter, I think I'd call it.
So even if you wrote about your entire life up to now, you would keep it that title?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I think I would. In another sense, I mean, at 15 or 20 years of age, I didn't believe I'd live beyond 30 because at that stage, people who had rheumatoid and that wasn't taken, Still's disease that wasn't taken care of, tended to die very young.
Hmm.
So I still kind of feel that I've stolen what I have now from winter.
Hmm. And I know when we were emailing back and forth as well, you mentioned being an atheist.
Mhm.
How did you, through your life journey, come to that conclusion?
Um, I suppose, like most teenage Irish boys, I was relatively religious
Yeah.
at 12 and 13 years of age. I suppose I was quite religious. And at some point, it occurred to me that uh, it, I now know it's known in Christianity as the Manichaean heresy. Um, I came to the conclusion that if God had created Still's disease and had created cancer and all those other things and sent them to try us, then he wasn't worth believing in. So that was the first step. Anybody who would do that to human beings, doesn't deserve our admiration and respect.
Hmm.
But at some point, I remember it was Christmas Eve, and the thought occurred to me that the whole thing was ridiculous. That it was a creation of the human mind. That humans seemed to need the idea of a god, and that therefore there was no need to continue believing in him. And I went on from there. I studied philosophy at university, and it just made me more convinced of that fact. I don't object to religion. I mean, I'm not a big fan of organized religions, I have to say, of any kind. But I don't object to people being religious, and I know priests and religious people who are the kindest of people. So I don't have a problem with it. But it isn't for me.
So, you said when you first, when when you were talking about God inflicting pain on people, was that when you were young that you had that thought?
Yeah,
Now, was it,
yeah. At
did
about
your,
15 or 16 years of age. Yeah.
okay, did your parents, or was it like the church you went to, or how did you come to the conclusion that God created those things?
Well, um, God created everything.
Mm,
So if God exists, he's the creator of everything. People say, but it was the devil who brought evil into the world. But the answer to that, of course, is that God created the devil. He had to have created them. They're not, God is the first,
mm,
and they're not coterminous. Uh, so, so that's really where I began. Everything ultimately is God's responsibility if God exists.
mm,
And that means that he created torturers, he created fascists, he created the Holocaust, everything in the world is God is all knowing. If he exists, he's all knowing. He can tell the future. Then he foresaw all of this, and that was the first step to changing my mind about it.
mm,
And I know all the arguments because I've had these arguments over the years. I know all the arguments about how God set the clockwork going and waited to see what would happen. But then at the same time, same people will tell me that God knows everything. God knows everything, then he knows how the clockwork was going to work out. So that doesn't wash. That's what we call sophistry. Trying to find a way out of a fact by finding clever arguments. And so that's where I came from, and that's my position.
what do you think
And
of,
it hasn't stopped me, uh, respecting people, respecting,
right,
uh, people's motives for doing things and so on like that.
what do you think, um, I'm curious to know because personally I've known some atheists, and in general, they do see life from a harder perspective, a more cynical one. And so for them, death is not something they fear as much as they just accept as a reality. What for you, how do you view death in light of the fact that there's nothing else?
Just that, really. There is nothing else. I I don't think there's an afterlife. Um, I'm open to persuasion. This is my wife, Liz.
Hello.
Um, I'm open to persuasion that there is some kind of an afterlife. You know, I often think the human personality is such an intense being that it's hard to imagine all that energy just disappearing out of the universe. You know, so I'm open to that. It doesn't bother me, but I don't think there's a heaven and a hell. I don't think there's going to be a punishment. Maybe the punishment will be that whatever energy is left behind will be racked with guilt about the terrible things it did during its existence, or happy that it didn't do those things. I don't know, but in any case, human consciousness does not continue in any way, I think. Um, I can't imagine that it does. Uh, I think um, the possibility of just disappearing is better than the possibility that there could be such a thing as eternal damnation. And that's something, again, that I find it hard to believe that a loving God could have created a hell. And I would prefer to simply disappear out of the universe than to have to face um, a judgment by somebody who created that kind of torment, you know.
Hmm. What if there's something about the world you could change? If you could, what do you think you'd pick?
An end to war would be good. That would
Like
be,
the concept
if
of
there was
war or just wars in
just an end
general?
to just war, just war. It would be good if people didn't kill each other, and if people didn't hurt each other. But if we just start with the worst thing possible, I think war is the worst.
Is there a war in particular that you found very difficult to understand?
It's not that I find them difficult to understand. I read a lot of history. I can understand why wars started. I can understand the mechanism that set them going. And I suppose ultimately there are two things that drive war.
Hmm.
One is racism, and the other is statehood. And politically, I'm against states. Uh, I can't I can't see them disappearing. They're not going to disappear now, but I think it would be better if we didn't have borders and we didn't have border disputes or territorial claims or whatever. So I mean, we're talking about war. We're talking about an enormous mechanism, an apparatus uh, of long-standing time, history, politics,
Hmm.
um, money, and so on like that. It's too complex really to reduce to a few sentences. Um, but and of course, there is no hope of ending war, none whatsoever.
What is there a time period in history that you, if you could go back to, if you couldn't live now in the present, is there a time of history that you'd want to live in or you would pick to live in?
Don't think so. Um, I suppose if I could move back in time and be well, as opposed to being saddled with what I have, um, I suppose no, I don't think so really. I think we're not doing too badly now in the world. As long as it lasts, we're not doing too badly. At least not where I live anyway.
What is there a book um that has been very inspirational to you or that you really love and have maybe read many times or just once?
there are many books. That's my trade. So there are many books that I love and that I've read more than once. Um, Obviously, in poetry, the poetry of W.B. Yeats, for example, the Irish Nobel Prize winner, I I've read many times, and I get great inspiration from it. The same for New Essays by James Joyce, but also uh, a beautiful book uh, by an Italian writer called Natalia Ginsburg, called Family Lexicon.
Hmm.
It's beautiful. I read it in both English and Italian, and in both cases, it's just beautiful. I suppose I prefer maybe to talk about writers than to talk about books. There are writers who've been very influential. If I go back to the early days of writing, Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, was hugely important to me. Treasure Island, of course, but even more than Treasure Island, I think Kidnapped,
Hmm.
which is a novel essentially about friendship. That's a really beautiful novel, much undervalued, I think, nowadays, but really beautiful. Yeah.
Did you like any like Edgar Allan Poe or like the more melancholy romantic poets?
Poe, not really. I wasn't into Poe, but definitely Keats, Wordsworth, Shelley, to a lesser extent Byron. Yeah, Keats, Shelley, Keats and Wordsworth would be my two really.
Yeah.
In terms of romantics, I really like them. And then Eliot, I loved Eliot. And other American writers as well. Theodore Rothko was a big influence on me. Um, and John Berryman, to a lesser extent Robert Lowell. So and then Irish writers, Patrick Kavanagh, people like that were huge influences on me.
So, and then just one last question for you. What piece of work that you have written, it can be a poem or a story, do you think really encapsulates who you are as a person?
That's a hard question because certainly where fiction is concerned, one of the things you're trying to do constantly is to put yourself aside and to um, in a way to hide yourself. There's a phrase comes to mind from the English writer, he would be 16th or 17th, early 17th century, Francis Bacon, this hiding and veiling of a man's self. I often think that fits really how fiction writers go about their work. They create characters in order to hide themselves and to avoid being in the center of the stage. Um, Possibly my most recent novel, which is called Empty Bed Blues, which is actually about two women, not men, um, is says a lot of what I think about life and about culture and language and translation and politics and all that kind of stuff.
Can you say
Um,
the title one more time? Because it was just
sure, the title comes, it's quoted actually in the book. The title comes from a song by Bessie Smith, a blues song called Empty Bed Blues.
hmm.
Empty Bed Blues. And it's a great song. Bessie Smith was, I think, the queen of the blues. But yeah, I think that book would be the one I'd point to.
What about it exactly? Like if you're gonna summarize, when you say it talks about what you think about life, what would be the summarization, the message of that in the book?
Well, right. Well, the basis of the story, which sort of happens before the book begins, so I'm not giving anything away, is that this Irish woman who's an academic, she teaches James Joyce, is suddenly widowed and discovers that her husband has incurred absolutely unconscionable debts.
Hmm.
And under Irish law, she's responsible for those debts. And she knows she'll never repay them. She can never repay them. And they're going to take everything banks and the revenue and all that. They'll take her house, they'll take everything that she has. And then one day there's a knock at her door, and this beautiful younger woman, this woman, the protagonist of the book is in her, I imagine, her 40s. And this younger woman knocks on the door and hands her a set of keys and walks away without a word. And she quickly discovers that the keys belong to her husband, and that um, they were the keys to a love nest that he had in Italy, a small apartment in Italy. And so she literally leaves everything behind. She thinks so that she's leaving everything to the banks; they can take what they want, and she's running away, and she's going to Italy. And so she begins another life there, and she's able to make that life because of the friendship and solidarity of another person that she meets, an older woman with whom she becomes very good friends. And the older woman begins to teach her about Italian culture and Italian language, and um, she becomes a sort of a mentor for her. And so it's a novel about friendship. To a certain extent, it's a novel about love as well, because she falls in love. And then you discover a kind of which I won't reveal, but that the older woman was once in love too. And it's a novel about politics, because the older woman she's based on a real Italian person, a woman called Rossana Rossanda, who was a partisan during the Second World War and was an organizer for the Communist Party of Italy afterwards. And so there's a lot of talk about that kind of thing. And then, there's a sort of, not quite a mystery, but there's a twist in the end of it as well. That's the book. And to me, it says a lot. There's a lot about literature in it.
Mm.
There's a lot about language. There's a lot about friendship, particularly, more so than love, really. The love is dealt with relatively straightforwardly, but there's a lot about friendship in the book, and in particular, a friendship between a younger and an older person.
Hmm. I need to read this. I'm getting very interested. It sounds like it would also make a great movie.
Hell yeah, I'm completely in agreement. If you happen to know any directors who are interested, you can pass on my email to them.
I know. I wish I was more richly connected in that way. Not really, but I
So
don't.
do I.
It's the networking. There you go. You have to do more of
Yeah, I know. I know. I know. Oh, well, I have an agent. That's his job.